Welcome to Session 5 of the Christian Foundations of Our Deepest Values. In this class, we will look at why we believe that victims matter, and why we think that there is moral strength in weakness.
Crosses along the boulevard. Crosses along the boulevard. Crosses along the boulevard. Crosses along the boulevard. The streets outside your window overflow. People staring, we know you the road. Repeatedly reminded by the looks on their faces. Know that tonight you'll be alright. Cast some light and you'll be alright.
Today, many of us firmly believe that victims matter. We believe that those who have experienced violence, theft, abuse, assault, slavery, or torture have a moral value precisely because of what they experienced. In other words, we believe that there is a type of deep moral strength in weakness, that there is a power in vulnerability. Many of us believe that those who are weak and those who have suffered should be heard. We believe that we should listen to victims, and that victims are owed some sort of restitution or recompense for their suffering. Indeed, this is how many of us today define justice, and some would even declare that victims are sacred. Where does this belief that victims matter come from, however? We can start by looking at the world of nature and evolutionary history. Does natural selection or evolutionary history give us any scientific evidence that victims matter? What does the science say? Excuse me, alligator. Do you believe that victims matter? What do you think? Hello there, turkey. Do you believe that victims matter? What do you think? Excuse me, Mrs. B. Do you believe that victims matter? Do you think victims matter? What do you think, little ground squirrel? Do you believe that victims matter? Do you believe that victims matter? Hello there, sweetie. Hi there. Do you guys think that victims matter? What do you think? You think victims matter? Yes? Did I hear a yes? Do you believe that victims matter? Do you believe that victims matter? What do you think? Take your time. Charles Darwin's understanding of evolution by natural selection is often described as the survival of the fittest. Here, the fittest organisms are those whose traits give them an evolutionary advantage that enables them to survive and reproduce. Natural selection happens when the fittest traits, or the traits that are the best suited to an environment, empower an organism to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits to their progeny. In discussing the evolutionary origin of species, Darwin writes this: The scientific bottom line, as Darwin sees it, is that all nature is at war in a struggle for survival. The victors of natural selection continue on, having their legacy in their descendants. The victims of natural selection are vanquished from the genetic record and forgotten, with the only remnant of them lingering in the stratigraphic sandstones of time. The edifice of evolution is built on countless corpses of competitors whose genes were not fit enough to survive into the next generation. Competition is the cornerstone, and in the struggle to survive, there is no second place or any compensation or consideration for victims. As contemporary biologist Richard Dawkins reflects, quote, "So long as DNA is passed on, it does not matter who or what gets hurt in the process. Genes don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. Nature is not interested, one way or another, in suffering unless it affects the survival of DNA." End of quote. For example, genes don't care about the victims of adolescent bullying. In fact, natural selection positively favors bullying. This study found that bullies held the highest social rank in the school environment and were perceived as the most attractive, with their victims showing the exact opposite. The researchers conclude that, quote, "The results lend support to the hypothesis that youth bullying is derived from evolutionary development." Another study found that bullies have more opportunities to sexually reproduce than non-bullies, and that the victims of bullies have even fewer opportunities. The science has shown that bullying allows the aggressor to demonstrate his or her physical strength, dominance over others, and rank in the social hierarchy. Numerous studies have found that bullies are considered popular, rated as cool by their classmates, and admired by their peers. Other scientific studies have found that male dominance and status gained through bullying are positively associated with their attractiveness to females. In other words, as boys were aggressive and bullied others, girls found them more attractive. And girls found the victims of bullying less attractive. In a similar way, science has found that females bully other females to attack the other's status for the purpose of knocking out their competition for resource-rich or desirable males. So adolescent girls bully other adolescent girls in order to get the attraction of the boys. For example, Campbell found that female adolescent aggression and bullying of other females was heavily associated with attacking one's reputation and fighting over specific high-status boys or males. Campbell notes that these verbal attacks, such as accusations of promiscuity and infidelity, were specifically chosen to damage the reputations of rivals and make them appear less sexually appealing, and that is precisely what they accomplished. Domination for social status to increase mating opportunities is ubiquitous among non-human animals as well. Through conflict, contestants fight to gain greater access to key resources that contribute to their reproductive success. And if you ever have watched the BBC series Planet Earth with David Attenborough, you will have seen many, many examples of this. In any case, the science clearly shows that being a bully is advantageous with regard to that which biologically matters most, and that biology doesn't think that victims matter. Evolution punishes the victims of bullying even more. Should we, therefore, follow the science and all become bullies to the best of our ability? Charles Darwin published his scientific work in the time of Charles Dickens, an author whose work spearheaded a global movement which focused on care, compassion, and concern for victims. Many in the age of Charles Dickens, including Dickens himself, accepted biological evolution as a scientific theory while rejecting the Darwinian view of life as it concerned humans, precisely because following the Darwinian science at the level of human action would mean casting aside the weak and abandoning the victims of biology, history, and society. Many of the scientists at the time understood that following the Darwinian science would be wrong for society because it would go against many of Victorian culture's most deeply held values. Even agnostic Darwinian evolutionary biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, who did not care one straw for sentiment, clearly saw that there was no scientific warrant or biological precedent for caring for victims or for protecting the weak. Thus, Huxley argued in 1893 that, quote, "the ethical progress of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process of evolution, still less in running away from it, but in combating it." End of quote. In his book Evolution and Ethics, Huxley contended that we must, quote, "refuse any longer to be the instruments of the evolutionary process," end of quote, and that morality must be, quote, "directed not so much to the survival of the fittest as to the fitting of as many as possible to survive," end of quote. A century later, another eminent agnostic evolutionary biologist, George C. Williams, continued this line of argument as he emphasized that science on its own could care less for victims, and thus we should not follow the science with regard to evolutionary biology. In a paper entitled "Mother Nature is a Wicked Old Witch," Williams says that, quote, "Today more than ever, natural selection can be regarded as a process that maximizes short-sighted selfishness. The practice of charity, with net cost to the practitioner, will always be disfavored by natural selection. That which is natural is far more often deserving of condemnation than imitation." End of quote. Thus, Williams says, we should never look to nature or to science for an exemplar for human conduct. Our values must not come from science. Today, preeminent atheist evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins similarly argues that we must not just follow the science when it comes to victims. Only by rebelling against the scientific evolutionary processes that made us, says Dawkins, can we sustain the values that we hold dear, such as caring for the weak and for the poor. While many in the age of Dickens and Darwin were wary of applying science to society, owing to their concern for the fate of victims, the poor, and the weak, others read Darwin's work on evolution and came to the exact opposite conclusion. These reformers, who believed that we should follow the science, argued that the principle of natural selection should be applied to human society through what they referred to as eugenics. In the same way that nature and the breeders of domestic animals make evolutionary progress through weeding out the unfit, eugenicists argued that human society could likewise make evolutionary progress through removing unfit humans from the reproductive equation. Victoria Woodhull, a prominent American suffragist, early leader in the women's movement, and first female presidential candidate, was also the very first advocate of eugenics in both the United States and Great Britain. In fact, Woodhull was campaigning for eugenics in both speeches and pamphlets a decade before Sir Francis Galton in England coined the term eugenics and statistically developed such ideas further. In her work, The Rapid Multiplication of the Unfit, Woodhull writes this: The eugenics of Victoria Woodhull and Sir Francis Galton became widely popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and eugenics was enthusiastically embraced by the social progressives of the time. As a historian of eugenics, Daniel Kevles points out, the eugenics movement was also broadly supported by the scientific establishment. Although eugenics began with Woodhull in America and Galton in England, it soon became a truly global movement, and eugenics laws were enacted in many countries that were seeking to modernize and wanting to break ideological ties with their colonial roots. Some of the most aggressive eugenics programs in the 20th century were found in Mexico, India, Japan, and China. Everyone knows about the Nazi eugenics program under Adolf Hitler. But what they typically don't know is that this was part of an international movement that had been growing and gaining momentum for over 60 years before that point. Mexico and the United States had eugenics laws, for example, and fully developed eugenics programs long before Germany did. And even Germany's eugenics program was not original to Hitler, but rather it began in the liberal, progressive Weimar Republic as a way to move beyond traditional Christian values and save society through science. As historian at Oxford, Paul Weinling points out, with regard to the international character of eugenics, scholars writing in the Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics write this: In the United States, eugenics was the scientific basis for creating new intelligence tests, such as the IQ test. And it was the scientific reason behind state laws requiring mandatory blood tests for couples seeking marriage licenses, the last of which, in the state of Montana, was finally repealed in 2019. Eugenics was foundational to the birth control or family planning movement in the early 20th century. And eugenics was also a key cornerstone of the women's movement. Many feminist organizations across the globe founded eugenic racial hygiene associations, which were renamed after World War II when words like eugenics and racial hygiene were no longer in vogue, or in Cosmo, or in Collier's. Historians of eugenics, Thomas Leonard and Daniel Kevles, discuss how eugenics was a key component of the early women's movement. The Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics describes how early feminists who advocated birth control programs embraced the eugenic cause to eliminate the poor and the weak from society, which they referred to as the evolutionary unfit. Regarding the scientific pruning of the weak of society, pioneering feminist, eugenicist, and birth control advocate Margaret Sanger writes, Margaret Sanger's eugenics vision deeply influenced the eugenics programs of India and China. Sanger's visit to India and China and her influence on the eugenics programs of these modernizing nations highlights an important and often misunderstood dimension of eugenics, namely that the international eugenics movement was not about white supremacy or racial hierarchy. Rather, the central idea of eugenics from the 1890s, or even earlier with Victoria Woodhull from the 1870s through the 1960s, was that each nationality, race, or ethnic group should strive to propagate the most evolutionary fit within that group, and to stop the most unfit within each group from reproducing. Eugenics was about using the Darwinian science to bring about the best in each race or ethnic group. In this way, many leaders and intellectuals in the African American community advocated eugenics as well. As historian of eugenics, Paul Lombardo discusses in his book, A Century of Eugenics. Following Victoria Woodhull, Francis Galton, Margaret Sanger, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and many others, social progressives in the early 20th century believed that progress, reform in education, and the modernization of the state demanded that society must follow the science, and that we should apply the scientific principles and findings of eugenics to the restructuring of society. American progressive eugenicists, both black and white, wanted to remove the perceived threat to society posed by people groups that were deemed unfit by the scientific experts. Family planning, birth control, and sex education for the poor, immigrants, and working classes were key elements of eugenics to prevent the so-called unfit from breeding. Forced sterilization programs were aimed at eliminating future generations of criminals, alcoholics, and those with low IQs who were deemed feeble-minded or imbeciles, because all of these conditions were thought to be hereditary and genetic. Scientifically progressive sterilization programs also targeted ethnic groups referred to as mixed or mongrel races, namely Eastern European Slavs, Poles, Russians, Southern European Italians, Greeks, and Jews.
Oh, Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Where you gonna run to? All on that day, will I run?
From breeding experiments with plants and animals, geneticists had discovered that the mixing or interbreeding of purebreds or domesticated types led to an evolutionary reversion to the wild type. The scientists of the time thus applied this evolutionary perspective to humans and argued that the interbreeding of pure races such as black Africans and white Anglos would revert or degenerate into a wild type of human exhibiting caveman-like characteristics, which eugenic scientists said is what one sees in the Jews, Slavs, Russians, Poles, Greeks, and Italians, the so-called mixed races. Progressives who followed the scientific expertise of the Eugenicists pushed for federal legislation to stop immigrants from these so-called mongrel races from entering the U.S. The Emergency Immigration Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 were aimed at stopping the influx of Jews, Slavs, Russians, Greeks, Poles, and Italians. With the passing of these laws, progressives and eugenicists rejoiced that the nation had at last decided to protect itself by barring the entrance of those that are unfit. In 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that, among the non-native born, citizenship was open to only white persons of Nordic and Anglo descent and black persons of African descent. This Supreme Court ruling followed the reasoning of anti-immigrant activists such as Booker T. Washington, who insisted that white Anglo-Americans and black African Americans are the only true Americans, because African Americans are, quote, more like the American white man, more willing to and able to observe the ideas of the American culture than other races which are now coming into the country. End of quote. Russians, Slavs, Southern Europeans, and Jews, the mongrel races as they were called, who were neither truly white nor truly black, were to be denied entrance and citizenship. The so-called mongrel races were human parasites, as they said, that needed to be stopped at the borders. And those who are already in the country needed to be prevented from breeding any further. The most progressive state, California, had the most progressive eugenics program, where over 20,000 people were forcibly sterilized between 1909 and 1963. And California's eugenically motivated sterilization laws inspired those of Nazi Germany. However, the most aggressive eugenic sterilization program of the 20th century was in the modern state of India under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi's eugenics program specifically targeted poor men, and she launched a compulsory mass sterilization initiative that went to the poorest areas of India and rounded up all men 15 years old or older into sterilization camps. She forcibly sterilized over 10 million men in 5 years of this program, and thousands died from botched procedures. A key part of the progressive agenda for reform in the early 20th century was to integrate the eugenics theories of the scientific experts into public school textbooks. State school board approved textbooks like George Hunter's A New Civic Biology, published in 1914, argued for the eugenic improvement of humanity through science. Hunter's Civic Biology taught that, quote, the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on the earth could be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. End of quote. And civic biology contended that it is, quote, not only unfair, but criminal to hand down to posterity the handicap of feeble-mindedness." End of quote. In a section on eugenics entitled "Parasitism and its Cost to Society," civic biology discusses people groups that scientifically and socially progressive reformers of the time considered to be human parasites, such as the feeble-minded, as they were called, people with low IQs, people with epilepsy, and alcoholics, whom they believed were alcoholics because of their heredity. In a section entitled "The Remedy," civic biology states this: the textbook Civic Biology was the same textbook that John T. Scopes was charged with teaching from in the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. This textbook was the centerpiece of the trial, upon which the various arguments focused. While the popular version of the story sees Scopes as a martyr for science, standing up against a repressive Christian establishment, the actual contentious issue at the time was not so much about teaching evolution in the public schools as it was about teaching the application of Darwinian evolution to human society through eugenics, and calling this application an established fact of science. Anyone today who asserts that the Scopes monkey trial was a case of science versus religion, and that religion was in the wrong, must insist, based on the historical context, that eugenics was and is a legitimate science, and that the Church was wrong to oppose the eugenics movement at the time of the Scopes monkey trial.
Oh, Lord, ain't my trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Oh, Lord, ain't my trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Went down the hill the other day, so got happy and stayed all day. Went down the hill the other day, so got happy and stayed all day. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Oh, Lord, and my trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God.
As a devout Christian and a defender of the poor and the weak, Bryan was a staunch opponent of eugenics. Thus, Bryan contended that society should not follow the science, when doing so would mean trampling upon the poor and the weak. In his closing statement of the Scopes monkey trial, Bryan warned, quote, "Science is a magnificent material force, but it is not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraints to protect society from the misuse of the machine. It can also build gigantic intellectual ships, but it constructs no moral rudders for the control of storm-tossed human vessels. It not only fails to supply the spiritual element needed, but some of its unproven hypotheses rob the ship of its compass and thus endanger its cargo." Like William Jennings Bryan, author and devout Catholic G.K. Chesterton staunchly opposed eugenics as both morally evil and scientifically unsound. Chesterton engaged in both political debate and public action and openly critiqued the eugenics movement through lectures, public debates, and essays. Chesterton believed the eugenics movement to be one of the great evils of society, and in Britain at the time, there existed so little public opposition to eugenic thought that Chesterton was often accused of irrationalism and being anti-science. Nevertheless, Chesterton waged a vigorous and ultimately successful campaign against the eugenic-inspired mental deficiency bill that was proposed in English Parliament in 1912. Much to Chesterton's credit, the final bill that was passed removed the clauses on compulsory sterilization and was void of the eugenics language that was in the initial bill of 1912. In his 1922 book, Eugenics and Other Evils, Chesterton contended that eugenics is a, quote, war upon the weak, end of quote, that provides scientific prowess to the powerful against whomever the powerful deem weak. In the case of eugenics, said Chesterton, the weak are the poor and the disabled. Eugenics, wrote Chesterton, attempts to eliminate one's headache by removing one's head, and it inhumanely eliminates those whom the powerful refuse to recognize as human. Such inhumanity, said Chesterton, is itself a type of irrational madness. Chesterton's book influenced public opinion to the degree that the British Parliament began to question eugenics legislation, and indeed eugenic legislation as it existed in the United States and in other countries was never passed in Great Britain. Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical letter of 1930, outlined a position similar to Chesterton's, and the Pope declared eugenics an evil that is aimed at eliminating the poor and the weak. Indeed, pretty much all of the chief voices of opposition to eugenics at the time were devout, conservative Christians from Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and evangelical traditions. These Christians argued that the weak should be protected and that victims matter. In part 2 of this discussion, we will explore why these Christians and many others before them believe that we should care for the weak and the vulnerable, and that the lives of victims do matter. I hope you can join us then.
Streetwise are back again.